You probably think a bell and a bowl of meat are just a curious anecdote, but this simple pairing rewrote the rules for how living beings learn. The story of Pavlov's dogs begins as an accidental observation and grows into a profound insight about how associations structure behavior. Imagine a scientist watching a dog salivate every time food appears, then ringing a bell until the bell alone makes the dog drool. This experiment looks almost ritualistic, but it reveals a mechanism of mind. The reason this matters is that those same invisible pairings shape our fears, cravings, and choices every single day. Classical conditioning is the psychological process where organisms learn to associate neutral signals with meaningful outcomes over time. The neutral stimulus gains ability to elicit a response because it has repeatedly predicted a biologically significant event. Ivan Pavlov was not trying to study learning when he discovered conditioned responses, but his careful observation turned physiology into psychology overnight. He originally studied digestion, measuring saliva produced by dogs, and he noticed that the animals would start to drool when the lab assistant entered, before any food appeared. In Pavlov's classic setup, there are 4 elements to learn and remember, each with a specific role in the learning process. The unconditioned stimulus naturally triggers an unconditioned response, like food causing salivation, and the neutral stimulus is the bell, which initially means nothing at all. Acquisition is the stage where the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are paired repeatedly until the neutral stimulus becomes conditioned. During acquisition, timing and consistency matter greatly because the brain learns statistical relationships between events over many exposures. Extinction seems like forgetting, but it is more accurately new learning that the conditioned stimulus no longer predicts the unconditioned stimulus. When the bell rings without food for many trials, the dog reduces its salivation because it has learned that the bell no longer signals food. Spontaneous recovery is the eerie return of a response after extinction has occurred and time has passed without further pairing. This phenomenon shows that extinction never erases the original learning entirely, it just overlays a competing memory with different predictions. Generalization is the mind's tendency to apply a learner response to similar stimuli that were not directly trained, which can be adaptive but also problematic. A dog conditioned to fear one bell might react to different tones, and a person who associates hospitals with pain might feel anxious at the sight of any medical symbol. Discrimination sits opposite generalization and teaches organisms to respond only to specific cues that predict meaningful outcomes. With careful training, a dog can learn to salivate only to a particular pitch, and a shopper can learn to prefer a certain brand logo while ignoring lookalikes. Higher order conditioning is the mind's ability to stack associations, where a conditioned stimulus becomes the basis for new conditioning without ever presenting the original unconditioned stimulus again. This layered learning explains how abstract symbols and rituals can acquire emotional weight through chains of association over time. Blocking reveals that not all stimuli present during learning become associated, because a familiar predictor can prevent a new cue from gaining meaning. When an established signal already predicts food, introducing another cue alongside it does not add anything, and the new cue remains ignored by the learner. Humans experience classical conditioning in subtle but powerful ways throughout development and daily life, shaping preferences and emotional reactions, often without conscious awareness. Infants learn to associate faces and voices with safety, while adults can develop cravings or aversions based on repeated pairings across contexts. In clinical settings, therapists use classical conditioning principles to alleviate suffering and reshape maladaptive responses through techniques like exposure and counter-conditioning. By gradually exposing someone to a feared stimulus without the expected negative outcome, therapists help retrain the brain's predictive model and reduce pathological anxiety. Counter-conditioning replaces an unwanted conditioned response with a more adaptive one by pairing the conditioned stimulus with a new positive or neutral outcome. For example, pairing relaxation exercises with a previously feared cue can transform panic into calm through consistent retraining of associations. Aversion therapy flips conditioning in the opposite direction by pairing an undesired behavior with an unpleasant stimulus, and while sometimes effective, this approach carries ethical concerns and potential for harm. Modern practice favors safer, evidence-based methods that prioritize consent and long-term well-being over coercion. Advertisers are masterful practitioners of classical conditioning, systematically pairing products with rewarding imagery, music, and celebrities until the product itself evokes positive feelings. A jingle or a logo can become a conditioned stimulus that triggers happiness, pride, or desire because it repeatedly predicts social approval and pleasure. Brands engineer environments to maximize associative learning by using colors, scents, and sounds that prime consumers for purchase, and these invisible cues can nudge behavior reliably over time. The science behind scent, marketing in stores, and catchy jingles in commercials is classical conditioning repackaged for profit. Real-world examples of conditioning are everywhere, from the visceral disgust we feel at a particular food after a bad illness to the conditioned anxiety at the sound of a dentist's drill. These responses can be benign, adaptive, or deeply debilitating, depending on the context and the history of pairings that produce them. You can recognize conditioning in your life by noticing cues that reliably predict emotional or physiological reactions within you, and tracking when those reactions occur without any conscious decision. Once you start observing associations, you can test them by removing or changing cues and watching whether your response fades or shifts. If you want to use conditioning principles ethically, begin by identifying the triggers you want to change and design consistent, predictable alternative pairings to replace them over time. Small repeated actions like pairing exercise with a favorite podcast or pairing a relaxation ritual with stressful emails can shift associations gradually and sustainably. Beyond therapy and advertising, classical conditioning underpins larger social dynamics where rituals and symbols bind groups together or push people apart, and these learned responses become cultural gravity that influences politics and identity. Understanding these mechanisms gives us a language to talk about persuasion, manipulation, and collective behavior at scale. At the edge of technology, algorithms exploit conditioning by delivering predictable rewards in the form of likes, novelty, and social validation, training attention with reinforcement schedules that mimic the psychology of skin-based learning. This modern conditioning operates at enormous scale and raises ethical questions about autonomy, consent, and mental health. If you look back at Pavlov's bell and forward to algorithmic nudges, you begin to see a single thread connecting biology, culture, and technology through associative learning. The philosophical twist is that while conditioning shows how much of our minds are shaped by contingencies, it also reveals the pathways to freedom because new pairings can be chosen deliberately. To close, classical conditioning is not a trap, but a set of tools that can heal and harm, depending on how intentionally we use them. And if this gave you a new perspective on why you feel what you feel, hit subscribe for more explorations into the hidden wiring of our behavior.